Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amanda Sutton, the Marketing and Events Director for Bookworks, your 35-year-old independent bookstore in the Rio Grande River Valley of Albuquerque. We are very pleased today to be with a friend of our store, a neighbor, Laura Paskus, a freelance journalist operating out of Albuquerque. Bookworks right now is closed for shopping, of course, during the pandemic. We are doing direct-to-home shipments from our website. Our website is Bookworks without the O's. So that's BKWRKS.com. Open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We do have lots of free shipping opportunities throughout the year. And of course, all of our virtual events are listed there at our website too. So be sure to check it out. I just built a list this last week of climate change books. Right there at the top being Laura Paskus' new book from the University of New Mexico Press, At the Precipice, New Mexico's Changing Climate. Thank you all so much for joining us today to discuss this ever important, ever changing, super timely, newsworthy topic that we all need to definitely learn more about. Our expert, our resident climate change expert-in-chief here, Laura Paskus, is going to tell us more about her new book. We'll do a question and answer at the end, so if you have something that comes up during her talk, feel free to type that into the chat, and we will address that after she tells us more about her book. So Laura, as I mentioned, is an independent journalist here in Albuquerque. She covers mainly the environment and also some social justice issues. She started her journalism career back at High Country News. She's also written for Ms. Magazine, the Santa Fe Reporter, the Weekly Alibi, UNM Radio, and right now she's a producer with New Mexico PBS, KNME. She's a correspondent over there at New Mexico in Focus, which brings us really great public affairs television. And she's also the producer of their show, Our Land, New Mexico's environmental past, present, and future. She is a former archaeologist, a tribal consultant, and as I've mentioned, the author of the new UNM Press book, At the Precipice, New Mexico's Changing Climate. Laura, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us all about your new book.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much, and thanks to Bookworks, and thanks to all of you who are spending some of your Sunday afternoon with me. I super appreciate it. I see your faces and your names popping up, and there's so many of you that I totally wish I could give a really big hug to and not worry about a pandemic. So it's really nice to see you, and I miss a lot of you a lot. So thanks for showing up today. Again, thanks to Bookworks for organizing this. I really appreciate it. And I have so many people to thank with respect to this book, not just friends who have listened to me talk and cry and yell probably about climate change for the past 15 or so years, but friends and colleagues who have read versions of pieces of chapters, but also a big thank you to the scientists and sources and experts out there. I am not an expert on climate change, but I have spent a crazy amount of time talking to people who are experts. So I appreciate all of those people, and we're really lucky here in New Mexico to have so many people working on climate and water and forest issues. So yeah, so anyway, as you know, I'm a journalist. I have never been a breaking news journalist, but still working on a book is a way different sort of time scale than working on a story for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or even a longer term project. Sort of pulling together the pieces of this book, I was really worried that it wasn't going to be relevant by the time it was published, just because books take a lot longer to sort of get done and to go through the academic press process than, say, a piece for KNME or even a magazine piece. So yeah, so I was really worried when I finished this in 2019, knowing it wasn't going to publish until toward the end of 2020, that, oh my gosh, it's not going to be relevant anymore, or things will have changed so much that information won't be useful to people. And here we are in a pandemic in a totally different world from when I finished the manuscript in 2019. But when it comes to climate change, it is really only more relevant. And we've seen the impacts of climate change sort of intensifying and accelerating in the last year. And I think we're really going to continue to see that happening. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about impacts we see here in New Mexico. You know, we're warming at roughly twice the rate of the globe. And there's, you know, some specific reasons for that, including that the oceans kind of can affect the rate at which you're warming. And obviously we're really far from an ocean. So we're warming. This warming affects lots of different things from our snowpack. You know, many of you have likely seen our winters change over the years. We still have wet years and dry years, but certainly with warmer years, that affects our snowpack, which affects our rivers, which affects our farmland and our forests and our fire season. It also sort of affects the relationships that we have with other states. Water issues become more and more intense as we share our rivers through interstate compacts, and water becomes more of a contentious issue. It changes our relationship with other users, whether we're a city and you know, whether it's cities and farmers or people who want to think about how we keep water in our rivers for environmental and ecological purposes. I know I can get sort of crabby when I see people wasting water on their lawns, or maybe doing an extra irrigation cycle when maybe the grass doesn't look like it needs it. You know, so it kind of affects the way we start seeing one another as well as the world around us. And we saw a lot of impacts of climate change this summer. There's a lot happening in the world right now. I'm sure many of you have seen the news about the deaths of migrating birds that New Mexico has been experiencing since August. And, you know, whether or not there's a direct correlation between the deaths of the birds and climate change, certainly these are all connected things, whether it's the intensity of the hurricane season, the intensity of the wildfires, cold snaps, the changes in seasons and weather patterns. You know, we're seeing these wildfires this year. This wasn't a terrible fire season for New Mexico, but it was an unusual one, and that our fire season usually tends to be focused earlier in the summer, and then we get monsoons, and that helps firefighters out quite a bit. This year, we had our more intense fire season in August, which is not normal for New Mexico. We're looking sort of out my front door right now and can see that the sky is not blue right now. I think that's been a really important reminder. If we're not, even if we're not directly affected by these fires in the Pacific Northwest or California happening right now, if we don't have friends and loved ones who are being evacuated or losing their homes or experiencing, you know, terrible respiratory impacts, we just have to look outside to remember that our skies are filled with, not to be super depressing about it, but our skies are filled with sort of the reminder of animals whose habitat has been destroyed and people whose lives have been destroyed. So a good reminder that it's all connected. We also this year saw a dry Rio Grande for more than 40 miles in the middle Rio Grande, which this year is a really important year to understand in terms of climate change. If y'all remember, in 2018, we had a really bad winter, and so we had a very, very bad dry spring. This winter that we just had was not a very dry winter, and yet we had a dry river for 40 miles. And so what's happening and what scientists continue to explain is we've entered into a new world that is warmer, and for the southwestern United States, which is already arid, warming means drying. And so as the landscape warms, our rivers lose more water, our reservoirs lose more water, our soils are drier and take longer to recover, our forests need more water to survive, and our croplands and our trees in our yard all need more water. So this year is a really important year for us to consider moving forward, in that even when we have a decent snowpack, the impacts to water and resources and habitats is still very much affected by warming. And so I think as New Mexicans, we've tended over the years that I've been covering climate and water issues, we have a very bad year, or we have a series of very bad years, and we tend to be like, oh, let's just wait for the monsoon season, things will be better, or things will be better next year with snowpack, or maybe we'll have a better winter, we'll move from La Nina to El Nino, and things will sort of conditions will be a little bit better. But it's really important for people to understand moving forward, especially water managers and farmers and people thinking about what trees they want to plant in their yards for the coming years, is that for the Southwest, warming means drying. We need to always be thinking about that for the future. So that's a lot of bad news, and you all haven't clicked off yet to go I don't know, have a stiff drink maybe. That's the bad news. The good news that I'm always reminded by scientists who I interview, especially Dr. Jonathan Overpeck, always talks about, the good news is that we know why climate change is happening. We understand exactly the relationship between human-caused climate change, the release of our greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. We know what impact that is having on our atmosphere, and we know that the more emissions we continue to release, the warmer and warmer it will continue to get. And unfortunately, we have released so many greenhouse gas emissions that even if we were to stop right now, warming would continue. But again, the good news is we know why this is happening, and we have tools, even if we choose to ignore them oftentimes. We have the tools to reduce emissions. And also at this point, we have a really good idea of what the various impacts are. We know, for instance, scientists have been saying for a very long time that warming was going to be having an impact on the Arctic, and that we would see warming in the Arctic, and we would see a loss of sea ice extent. We know that sea level rise will happen. We know, like I mentioned before, that warming means drying for arid places like the Southwest. We know all these things are happening. And so there are ways that we can think about not just mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, but think about adaptation and forward-thinking ways. And even though we don't always do a great job as humans when it comes to watching out for the most vulnerable among us, we do know better. And I think as a species, we can think about how to think about adaptation for our communities in ways that are just and that protect people, and are forward thinking about what we need to do for the future. And so that's the good news, I guess. I want to make sure that we leave a lot of time for questions, because I know that lots of you will have good questions and comments. So with that, I'm just going to move into a very, very short reading, and I'm totally going to walk away from you all to turn a light on. So I'm super sorry I didn't plan that ahead of time. And you can't see him, but my dog is sitting right here. He was keeping you company that whole time. So I think one of the things that I was hoping with this book was to write something for general readers that would help general readers understand why the climate is changing, what the impacts are here in New Mexico, and why we should care and pay attention. But I also wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a book about like all the challenging things that are happening, or sort of the exact I wanted to not just be the science of what's happening or even the history of what's happening. I kind of wanted to make sure that people felt connected to these sources of mine who've been so generous over the years. But I also felt like it was important that I admit that covering climate change really stinks. It's really sad and frustrating, and I get super annoyed, like annoyed and frustrated with the human race, and the things that we do and we don't do. And it is sort of overwhelming. And so I didn't want to not admit to those feelings. So anyway, so I'll just read. It's safe to say that 2018 was a tough year in New Mexico for farmers, but also for anyone paying attention to rivers and reservoirs, and anyone paying attention to the world around us. That fall, I gave a handful of presentations about water, climate change, and politics in quick succession over a few weeks, flashing the requisite slides on the screen: a dry Rio Grande in April, low reservoirs in summer and fall, graphs showing temperature increases over decades. I watched people's faces in the audience. I watched their shock over emptying reservoirs, their grief at the photo of hollowed out fish at the edge of a sandy channel, where they took refuge until the last puddles dried. I watched the older white men whose faces were physical manifestations of the messages I sometimes receive. What does she know? And I thought for a long time afterward about the silver-haired woman who teared up when she mentioned her brand new grandbabies to me. She turned from me as she wondered aloud about their future. Then she stopped talking, and I certainly didn't know what else to say. In October 2018, a special report released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change explained we have about a decade to prevent catastrophic and irreversible warming, but that's only if we choose now to change our energy systems. For more than a century, we've extracted fossil fuels from the ground and burned them to power our economy, drive our cars, heat our homes, and fuel our war campaigns across the world. It turns out that burning up millions of years worth of carbon in only a century or so has consequences. Like many of the people whose faces I watched, I felt the tug of despair. And over the past few years, I'd even tried to stay my heart against landscapes that previously offered solace. It's not emotionally restorative, after all, to witness swaths of conifer forest degrade from green to brown in a matter of seasons. To watch the Rio Grande turn from mud to sand in April, when snow melt should have been swelling over its banks. To see a favorite little canyon where every year I watched Tinajas fill with water, then tadpoles and snakes stay mostly dry even after monsoon season. That's not to mention wildfires, expanding dunes, oil fields, natural gas flares, changing ecosystems, shifting migrating patterns, and disappearing wildlife species. It's my job as a journalist to bear witness and to report these changes. But over the past few years, I started failing to notice beauty beyond the scars. And I found it even harder to connect with humans, even those I love the most. Then I busted my rotator cuff, and it was impossible to drive without contorting myself to steer and shift with one hand. So I started walking around my neighborhood, and I see one of my neighbors who I super love, who I met walking around the neighborhood, instead of driving to hiking trails where it's my habit to sort of actively avoid anyone else who might be out there too. In late October 2018, I started walking an hour-long loop that left me standing at the corner of a field full of sandhill cranes just before sunset. And I'm sure lots of you are familiar with this sort of activity. I would watch the Sandia Mountains turn pink and then purple while the cranes lifted off in small groups, heading west toward the river for the night. Sandhill cranes rely upon the Rio Grande for shelter at night and to navigate, as they have for thousands of generations, north in the summer, south in the winter. As weeks passed, more people clustered along the field each day. Almost always we would stand quietly waiting for the birds to run a few skipping steps and take off to the west to settle in groups in the river for the night. We'd smile up at the sky as their wings powered them toward the river half a mile away. Then, transformed, we would each head back to our families and loves, responsibilities, and challenges. It wasn't until one November weekend that the pre-twilight ritual reminded me to pull out a picture my daughter had drawn for me in elementary school. In yellow highlighter and ballpoint pen, she captured a flying crane, its neck outstretched and its feet dangling. You all know what that looks like when their feet are dangling, and it's the greatest thing in the world. She drew that after a visit to Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. I kept it even though the ink has faded and I can barely see the words she wrote in the top corner. Cranes are our fall gods. Year after year, when the birds migrate here to winter along the Rio Grande, their calls remind me, and likely anyone who hears them, of the past. Their whirring croaks have a primordial quality, and even in the middle of Albuquerque, it's possible to close your eyes, listen to the calls, and imagine the past, and just maybe imagine a future too. I think climate change is really overwhelming, and it really is a very scary issue, but that just makes it all the more important that we don't stop learning and learning what's happening, and that we don't turn away. And I understand, even for those people who haven't been directly impacted by the pandemic, and by that I mean by the loss of loved ones, by being sick themselves or losing their jobs or things like that. The pandemic has made things trickier. People having to evacuate and shelter from wildfires and hurricanes, and it's drawn attention away and energy away. But in some ways, I feel like this pandemic has opened my eyes to the desire that people have for change, for the desire people have to, when faced with these different choices in our lives, to simplify, to be with the people who we love the most, to choose who we have in our little bubbles right now, to find solace where we can, and to find joy where we can. And I think it's also, in many ways, laid bare this very dangerous notion of American exceptionalism that we've embraced. Whether we realized it or not, I think we've been told forever and ever, through schooling, through media, through advertising, that Americans are the best at everything. And I think this pandemic has really laid bare in very stark terms that we are not the best. And we are certainly not the best at taking care of one another, at taking responsibility, at taking action, at taking care of the earth or one another. And I think covering climate change really opened my eyes to that really starkly about 10 years ago when I was covering the international climate negotiations in Cancun. I had gone to Brussels to cover a meeting that was leading up to the United Nations meetings, and basically the Europeans were meeting to talk about how to get Americans on board with mitigation, with adaptation, with funding, sort of these various funds that were meant to help developing countries and help Pacific nations who were losing their islands. And that was a really eye-opening experience to see all of these other leaders of the world coming together to figure out what to do about the problem of America. And then going to the United Nations meetings and seeing how, not just how Americans really thwarted any kind of action on climate change, but to see how other people from other countries were talking about the United States. And I'm just going to read this, just 2 paragraphs. Despite our notions of American exceptionalism, most of the people I met in Cancun in 2010, this was during the Obama administration, knew that the United States government would never lead on climate change. They were looking to other countries, including China. But people were still curious why Americans fall for the histrionics of industry-funded climate change deniers when it's clear what's happening to the planet. They wondered when Americans would pay attention to the rising seas, the Amazon's burning forests, and the glaciers melting from mountains across the globe. They wondered why Americans don't demand their government become a responsible member of the international community. They were wondering, but they're not waiting. That became painfully clear to me as I headed toward the airport with my fellow South African passenger. Everyone used to want to be like America, she said. I think that is not the case anymore. So Trump has been a nightmare for the environment, for the planet, for human rights, for many different reasons. But I think it's important for us all to remember that America's problems with climate change and with thwarting action and not taking action on climate change go way before Trump. So I think one of the things that the pandemic has done, to get back to that point, is to remind us or to show us that we are not exceptional as Americans. We are not, sort of number one, the great good guys. And if we want to be the good guys, we need to be working a lot harder on lots of issues, but especially climate change. And I think a humbling of Americans is something for us to be thinking about, and how that can benefit so many other people on the planet and the planet itself. One of the other things, and I'm not really saying like, yay, pandemic, but I think there are lessons to have been learned from the pandemic. And one of those is something really local and kind of beautiful, is we've seen that this spring and summer is we've had to find different things to do with ourselves and with our children. And one of the things that I've really noticed is how many more people are at the river and taking their kids swimming in the Rio Grande and playing along the banks of the Rio Grande. Whether it's because the pools were closed or summer camps were closed or whatever the reason was, the river was low, and that was hard to see this year through Albuquerque. But now for all of those kids who spent their summer swimming and playing in the river, it normalized that relationship with the river in a way that I have not seen since I've lived here since the late 90s. And I think that's really exciting, and that matters for the future of the river, because we totally have our work cut out for us as New Mexicans, as Americans. Like, there is a lot of work to be done with respect to climate change. But I think one of the most exciting things is that we also have to remember to experience joy, and joy in our home state and our neighborhoods. Because when we're out there, we're noticing things. We're noticing what's normal and what's not. We're noticing what's blooming and what maybe isn't blooming this year, and we can ask why. We're noticing that there are, migrating birds dying. We're noticing which of our trees are surviving and which ones aren't. And I think when we notice these things, we can know better what we want to have and what we want this world to be. And so I don't want to leave anyone with a message that there isn't hope for the future, or that there isn't still genuine joy and beauty, especially in a place like New Mexico, where so many of us are so lucky to live. And so I would love to hear your questions or your observations, and I really appreciate Bookworks letting me talk to you all and see all your faces in your living rooms and kitchens. So I don't know, Amanda, do you want to handle the questions, or how does that?
Yes, absolutely. We have some comments. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and pop those into the chat. Thank you so much, Laura. I loved hearing your reading. I like how you balanced the good news with the bad. That's quite talented, I have to say. A lot to do. John Geisman also noted that. He says, I like your emphasis on the good news. He's a retired professor. He wanted to talk to you a little bit maybe, or have you talk a little bit more about rate. He thinks that talking to some of the climate deniers about the issue of rate might be a good way to help them understand how important some of these climate change issues are. If they feel like they can't understand them from just maybe a fundamental perspective, or there's something blocking that, maybe talking about how the earth is changing at a more rapid rate might be a way to kind of get them into the issues. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great idea, John. I've really struggled over the years with climate deniers. I think when I was younger and maybe a little bit less cocky, let's just say, I think I spent a lot of time trying to convince climate deniers or convince people that they should listen to scientists. And I've really changed that in recent years. If you don't want to, if you're unwilling to observe the world around you and exhibit a little bit of curiosity as to what is happening, I just can't waste time on you. There's so many pressing, there's so much pressing work to do. And so I've really strayed away from trying to convince anybody that these things are happening. But one of the more effective ways that I found to be having conversations with people who maybe are on the cusp of caring about climate change is to really ask people, well, what changes have you seen in your lifetime? And what do you think why do you think these things are happening? Like, why do you think there are tens of thousands of acres of dead conifers? What do you think is happening? And try to relate climate change to things that they might be seeing in their daily lives. I have family in Connecticut, and one of the things, I try to talk about with them there is, summers are a lot hotter than they used to be. There's also, all sorts of coastal issues with rising sea levels and projected rising sea levels, hurricanes, trying to connect with people on those sorts of details, even if they don't want to understand sort of the global impacts. But I think the rate issue is really interesting, and another way to try to explain to people what's happening.
Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit more about data. We have some questions coming in that are a little bit more specific. We've got one that wants to know about oil drilling data. I think what it's asking is if you were able to obtain or you've ever covered oil drilling on the Navajo Nation, and this person is specifically talking about the Chuscas.
Yeah, so there's one or two chapters in the book about oil and gas development on the eastern Navajo Nation and the areas around Counselor and Nageezi and Chaco Canyon. I did not cover the Chuscas though, but there is quite a bit of coverage in the book about the Eastern Navajo Nation and some of those different issues, including activism among, local Dene people around the issues in their own communities.
So you're looking more at the New Mexico side then. I know the Chuscas are on the Arizona, right on the Arizona side there. Okay, we've got a comment from Dee Friesen. This person says, I teach a weather and climate class for Lewis University, and instead of giving a final, I have my students research climate change. After 50 plus students, the most common response from the students was, I had no idea it was this bad.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? I mean, it's so interesting to me that we've known that climate change, we've known that greenhouse gas emissions and warming were connected. We've known for a long time. I think it's really interesting. I was interviewing Senator Udall a few years ago, and he told me, which I did not realize at the time, and I've been sort of obsessed with for the past few years, that in 1965, President Johnson's science advisors talked to him about this connection between what was happening in the the emissions and what was happening in the atmosphere and how that would have potentially really severe consequences for the nation. That year, President Johnson addressed Congress about this problem, and yet we just really didn't want to do anything about it. But we've known for so long, and really the impacts are becoming more and more stark and more severe.
I don't know if this is a question for you, Laura, but I do sort of wonder about what's the sort of divide with the younger generation? Because on the one hand, you see people like Greta Thunberg and all these very young activists that are so involved, so committed to climate change questions already. Hardcore activism going on from young people. And then maybe on the other hand, you have a lot of young people that aren't quite as tuned into it. I know you've got a child, a preteen, teenager. I don't know if you have any insights into, or you learned anything in writing your book about how there are any kind of generational differences in how New Mexicans view climate change.
Yeah, the youth activists are so inspiring, and of all the places that I look and try to find hope, the youth activists are just awesome. And in part, not just because of the work that they're doing and the pressure that they're putting on local, state, and federal, and even international leaders, but their breadth of knowledge about climate change is awesome. I feel like when I talk to younger people, they have such a better grasp of climate change and the emergency of climate change than so many adults do. And I think that's because for so many of us, life has always sort of gotten better, right? There's always been sort of this element of, as you get older, you'll have more opportunities, you'll earn more money, you'll have a family, you'll have a house, you'll do this, you'll do that. You'll kind of like keep moving up in terms of success and the way we've defined success. And for younger generations, they're facing so much uncertainty, even prior to everything happening with the coronavirus, whether it's the school shootings or concerns about the economy and student loans and, having successful careers as they get older. They have a knowledge that not only will they have fewer opportunities as they get older, but the planet has changed and there's more uncertainty in the world. And so I think even young people who maybe aren't activists or, sort of science leaning have an idea that the world is very different from the world their parents and grandparents knew. And they're very, very aware of that and very concerned about that. And I think about all the young people right now who, whose families are being affected by the wildfires and affected by the hurricanes. And that's just going to happen more and more, where you have generations of young people who, are essentially climate migrants within the United States. And so I think young people have a very clear picture that we are in an emergency.
Maybe that will urge them to be the ones showing us how to behave more for the common good. I know Dee Dee Feldman here, she's got a comment. Hello, Senator Feldman. She was making note, I think this was when you were talking about going to the climate conference and how there was a whole conference around how to get Americans to behave right. She says, it seems like what you're talking about is the inability of Americans to act for the common good, something beyond a short-term well-being, which is apparent in our attitudes toward climate change and just a general refusal to change. And I think viewing things as being more dependent on one versus the actions of all. And as she notes, this is a political and moral problem. And I think also just a cultural difference between Americans. You talked about that exceptionalism, but I think also too, being such an individualistic society as we have always been and never been able to really shift away from that. I think that's been really stark with the pandemic. And it's also why we can't get on board with all the climate change accords and other things that everyone else in the world is already doing.
even our, like, these arguments over masks, and who will wear a mask and who won't, I think, oh, good criminy crickets. If you can't even decide to wear a mask to at least put forth the illusion of trying to protect your community, how are you going to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions? But then on the other hand, I see, like, not to keep talking about my neighborhood, but I see people in my neighborhood wearing their masks all the time, and I feel this like swell of love for people who are like, I care about my community and I'm gonna protect my community, and I want to like continue to feed off that that affection that we show for one another.
Absolutely. And thank goodness to be here in Albuquerque and in New Mexico. It does seem like people are really getting behind the mask mandate. Okay, so here's some more specific questions. We have tons of questions here. Does your book, this is from Mark, does your book deal with projected demographic shifts in New Mexico due to climate change, changes in demography? If so, are policymakers being educated about these trends? What do you know about that?
So I do not address that issue. And I would like to think, so the vast majority of this book takes place during the administration of Governor Susana Martinez. And during that time, I would have said, even if policymakers were being educated about that, they would not care and would not do anything about it. But I have a lot more, the current administration is definitely more science-based and does have lots of staffers and people in positions of authority and leadership who do care about these issues. So I would like to be hopeful that, yes, people are paying attention.
Here's a question from another Mark. I read way back that there's a 400-year drought cycle in the US Southwest, and we're heading into it now with climate change exacerbating the so-called normal cycles effects in years to come. Is this accurate?
So that's a really great question. So along with this sort of trend of warming that we see, sort of imposed on that are these natural cycles, these climate variability and cycles of wet and dry. And so I'm not totally, I would have to go back and look. I'm not sure about the time scale, but you know, when scientists have looked back in the record, especially through tree ring studies, you know, there are these very big, there's these very long, very dry periods that the Southwest has experienced. And you can see, you can sort of superimpose those records over sort of the archaeological records of how humans have adapted and moved around the Southwest. But one of the things that's really interesting and sort of scary to think about is we do have these natural cycles of wet and dry. And like I mentioned earlier, because warming does mean drying for the Southwest, those drier periods will be even drier because we continue to be warmer. So you raise a really good point though about this natural variability and these wet and dry cycles in the Southwest that are really important. And so, yeah.
Okay. Do you believe that the Earth's oceans and atmosphere will come back into equilibrium one day, or have we forever lost a stable climate?
Oh, I know you asking that question. I don't know. Honestly, I mean, I feel like I just don't know. I don't know the extent to which we have really messed things up. And I think we're going to find that out in the next few years. I mean, so many things that scientists forecast that would happen, whether it was the loss of sea ice in the Arctic, or the rate at which the glaciers are melting in places like the Himalayas, for example. You know, scientists forecast these things and they're happening. You know, their models, their forecasts were right, but they're happening on such a faster time scale than I think anybody really anticipated, that it's really hard to say. It's really hard to say. I think we are in for a very interesting few years, centuries.
All right. Why is it important for media on the local and regional level to report and cover in depth on the issue of climate change? You could give New Mexico media a grade on climate change coverage. What would it be?
That is such a great question. I whew, I really like. I love to read the New York Times or the New Yorker, or sort of, you know, those big, well-funded, well-resourced papers with, you know, amazing reporters. They're great, but I think local media is the most important media. And unfortunately, I really feel like New Mexico, for a number of reasons, has really failed at covering climate change. And 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 I think that when your local newspapers aren't covering climate change as something that is normal and happening and affecting people's daily lives, then that helps. That has helped politicize the issue in a way that is ridiculous and counterproductive. And so I really wish that climate change coverage were normalized within business stories, within even like arts and entertainment stories, certainly within political coverage. One of my huge pet peeves is commercial television, and the weatherman says, "It's another hot one," and you know, we're like just busting through heat records, and there's no mention of why that's happening or how that's going to continue to happen every summer. And so I think that there are ways that readers can be really helpful with that, is pushing back against local newspapers and pushing back against commercial TV stations, um, and asking why they're not covering climate change. You know, why they're not. I mean, what farmer in the world doesn't want more detail about forecasts for not just the next few days, but for the next season? Um, it's really been frustrating and aggravating to see that climate change has been relegated to like a special interest story, or a story that only environment reporters cover. And so, yeah, that's a great question, and I think that it's changing and getting better. But part of the problem is also that newspapers, especially newspapers in New Mexico, have just been cut to bare bones. And so, as much as I wish that they were covering more climate change, I don't know what reporter left at any of these newspapers would have the time to be doing it.
Sad news. And for some stations, it's definitely not going to be the weatherman talking about it. Okay, so here's another one. Have we passed the tipping point? I think we talked about that a little bit. It seems that there is a rapid acceleration of the extremes. Another person wants to know if you know anything about the 2021 legislature and anything about legislation coming up.
So I would be optimistic for the, well, stupid coronavirus. I would have been optimistic for the 2021 legislative session. You know, it's unfortunate that we really lost 8 years under the Martinez administration, because not only was her administration actively and aggressively anti-science and anti-environment, you know, the agencies that deal with environmental issues are still underfunded, still have huge vacancy rates, just crushed just crushed everything for those 8 years. But at the same time, the legislature knew that Governor Martinez wouldn't be signing any strong water legislation or climate related legislation. So there was no point even in trying to get it through the legislature if she was just going to not sign it or let it die. So I'm optimistic that the 2021 legislature will be better, but I also know that they are grappling with budget shortfalls and sort of emergencies all around the state. But I'm hopeful that they'll remember that climate change is also one of the emergencies to be dealing with.
Okay, Ted has a question. What is the current status of the ozone layer, say from 1950s to the present time? What specific things can we do to improve its condition?
So the ozone layer issue is a really great one to look at in terms of, we saw that there was a problem and internationally, countries took action to work together and address that problem. And granted, people were still able to make profits off of the new products that they could manufacture and sell that didn't degrade the ozone layer to quite that extent. So it's not as difficult as the climate issue to get action on an international level, but I think that is a really good example of how countries came together and actively worked to address that problem. So we're in a much better situation than we were, 10 or 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's actually Ozone Day, World Ozone Day just passed, a day devoted to it, which I thought was interesting. Okay, this is another fossil fuels question. With 25% of New Mexico state funding coming from oil gas, what can our state do to remain solvent and able to improve without supporting these climate destroying industries? Who's working on other state funds generation, other funding sources that might align more with environmental stewardship?
So there's definitely a lot of work around that in New Mexico with respect to trying to lift up the renewable industry in the state. I think, again, I don't make light of the pandemic in any way, but I think one of the opportunities that the coronavirus has shown us is that relying on one industry like the oil and gas industry is not going to work. Even if climate change were not an issue, that reliance on one industry is not economically smart for us, especially. And so we can make choices now to move away from that in a, as responsible a manner as possible for communities and for workers, or we can just keep continuing to pretend that oil and gas is either one, the answer to all our economic problems, which it's clearly not, or two, that industry is so powerful and we can't possibly ever stand up to it or change it in any way. And I think the economic conditions and the social conditions right now provide an excellent opportunity for us to be making better choices now, so we're not in such a bad situation in the coming years.
All right, let's hope we do that. Kara points out an article in the July 20th issue of the New Yorker called Crossroads. It's about the plague and how pandemics wreak havoc and create economic, social, and cultural changes. So check that out when you get a chance. Andrew Stone popped the link there in the chat. Another question from Anthony regarding journalism. What wisdom or inspiration do you have for young journalists beginning their work in environmental journalism?
So that Crossroads article was awesome. If y'all haven't read it, I totally suggest finding that. And that's a great question about journalism, and my advice is terrible and nobody should take it. But my advice is that if you want to be a journalist and these issues of democracy and public education and helping your community understand the world around it in ways that help people make better choices, that you should do it. all the time, no matter what anybody tells you. And you should accept the fact that you will not make a good living for yourself, and you will drive your family and your friends insane, and you will likely be mostly a crazy person. But if that is okay with you, then journalism is the greatest thing that you can do with your life, in my opinion, and the most fun. And you meet the most interesting people and have the privilege of um, helping people understand the world around them. So I would say find the thing that you are passionate about, that you can't stop wondering about or can't stop talking about, and pursue that maniacally and with your entire soul, and accept that it will be crushing, and have a great time.
All right. That sounds like it's probably accurate for most types of. Okay, Linda Lockett, she's installing Senator Udall as the Secretary of the Interior. What do you think will be his first priority?
Oh, that's such a good question. Oh my gosh. Holy smokes, that's a great question. God, there's so many things. Oh my God, I just don't even know. I think like kind of a not very exciting thing, but a really necessary thing would be to sort of change the way the Forest Service is funded in terms of fighting wildfires. I think that's one of our big problems in the West, is we spend a lot of money dealing with catastrophic wildfire, and that money gets sucked out of the Forest Service's budget so that they're not able to do preventative work, they're not able to do environmentally beneficial work. And so I think, as boring as it might be, kind of shifting the way certain things are funded would be a really, really helpful and useful thing to do. Although I guess as Secretary of the Interior, he wouldn't have any control over the Forest Service because that's USDA, but I don't know. There's a lot of work to do.
Okay, this is a good segue into the next question. Phil is talking about New Mexico's national forests, particularly down in the southwest, the Gila, and they're poised for conflagrations, he says. What can we do to try to mitigate the probability of fire in our national forests here in New Mexico?
Yeah, so the fire guys I talked to would mostly say we need to really need to accelerate our forest restoration projects, like thinning, like controlled burn, like prescribed fire, and be doing that. I think some folks would say we need to be thinking about doing that on a watershed sized scale, since these fires have such big impacts downstream always. But I think just sort of that ability to mobilize resources and personnel to be doing these big projects, which of course is really hard right now. We lost some time this spring because of the coronavirus and the inability to be having crews out in certain places. I think that's the main thing, is changing the way we think about fire in forests, and also being able to do some of these big projects.
Okay, and then just some other comments coming in. Andrew Stone was noting some solar tied energy bills coming up in the 2021 legislation. That's great. I think New Mexico is really hopefully going to be stepping that up a lot on the solar energy front. Tony says, thank goodness for PBS and your work, Laura. Dee notes that Reagan was involved in the ozone agreement. Connie has a question. What about the current administration's deep involvement with the fossil fuel industry? Is that undermining their scientific approach? That's not in quotes, sorry. Their scientific approach and commitment to renewables.
Yes, it is. And we saw the same problem in New Mexico during the Martinez administration. Yes, it is a worrisome thing when you have people in positions of power and authority within the government making decisions for their friends and shareholders and others who directly benefit from the exploitation of resources.
Okay, folks, anyone else have anything they want to fire off here? I want to thank you for your talk today, Laura. I was taking some notes while you were speaking. I think one of the hardest things for me with all of this, climate change is so important to me, and I'm always trying to do more and do better. You talked a lot about how it is just can become so depressing and feel so overwhelming, and there's so much fatigue around the activism around it. And you did note some very amazing, awesome things we can do, and how wonderful it is that children are down by the river and walking along the acequias and all of that. Do you have any parting words for us about things that we can do to sort of overcome the fatigue around these topics, and just any last parting words of joy?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of you probably live here in New Mexico, or you live some other beautiful place. And I think that just that being outside, even if it's in your own neighborhood, you don't need to, if you live in New Mexico, you do not need to go very far from your own home to experience a sense of joy and gratitude for this beautiful place that we live in, where we're connected to so many species and so much history. So I think that, like, giving yourself that permission to be happy and joyful in the outdoors, and to not feel like, oh crap, it's smoky out again today, and everything is terrible. But like, it's actually, even now, it is okay to feel happy and joyful and thankful. And I think one really important thing to remember is that action is really needed on a local level as well. And you know, we have a really great congressional delegation in that they understand science and they understand climate change. Never mind that they're often also advocates for environmental protections. But to keep letting your congressional delegation know that these are important issues to you, to be calling their offices, and to be in communication with your state legislators and your city council people and your mayors. These are people who hear all the time from industry. You know, industry has no problem letting elected officials know exactly what they want. And you should have no problem always letting your elected officials know what you want too.